I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we are going to look at a poem from the Qianlong Emperor.
Really?
Which is, for some folks, the high point of Chinese civilization.
Not the poem necessarily, but
No, the reign itself.
There's no one out there going, this poem, this is it. It never got any better in China than this poem.
No.
It's interesting, actually, that you chose it or found it. It's not one of those that's anthologized. You just dug it up from somewhere. I don't know where.
Yeah, it had been translated into English as a prose poem, but it really has, like I just found it referenced in a book on the Macartney mission in 1793.
And it's an interesting one because you and I recorded a podcast once on a poem by Voltaire, the French philosopher, writer, etc., about or for the Qianlong Emperor. And we
that
wondered
is written to the
Right.
Qianlong Emperor.
Basically praising him for being full of civilization while France is going down the toilet.
Which Voltaire, and I'm not saying that China was or was not great, but Voltaire knew nothing about China.
No, except what he'd heard from third, fourth, fifth, 20th hand sources. But you and I wondered at the time, did Qianlong ever write a response to Voltaire? Well, not necessarily.
Not really.
But he did write a poem about the West, and this is that, well, not about the West, but in response to the West, and this is that poem.
Yeah, so just a little bit of the background. The Qianlong Emperor, I believe he actually may be, I forget if he is actually the longest serving emperor in imperial Chinese history.
I believe he is.
We would have to go double check. We'll get the podcast staff to
the podcast research team, i.e. Wikipedia,
to check on that. But he definitely served for a really long time, and it depends also on how you count his reign because he retired for the last couple of years. But he was in charge in 1793 when an English ambassador, Macartney, he actually, I apologize to my listeners in the UK. He was not English. He was Irish. He
don't mess that up, my
friend.
But
he was. I know, right? Like that's
we're
in the
a
danger
no-no.
zone. But so he was an Irish aristocrat who was sent by King George III. For those of y'all who are Americans, you'll know King George III. He was sort of involved in American history a little bit.
As the one that got his butt handed to him.
But he was involved with the China trade. So Macartney, at the time in the 1790s, Britain was increasingly becoming dependent on tea from China. That was sort of, caffeine was running the British economy, and it was industrializing Britain. There was a problem because the British didn't have anything that the Chinese wanted.
Right.
They made some cool stuff.
How about this wool? No, thanks.
So they had lots of raw materials, but that wouldn't be really
China was so
reasonable.
big that they had most of what they
And also
needed.
you can't transport those kinds
Right.
of heavy, like low value raw materials over long distances at this point. But they did have some cool things like mechanical clocks and other things.
Industry.
This is the beginning of industrial Britain. This is the first industrializing nation. But they had trouble penetrating the Chinese market. One of the reasons for that was because the Chinese really wouldn't let the British or pretty much any other Westerners into the Chinese market. Most Westerners and most foreigners were essentially kind of sequestered in one island in southern China, and they couldn't leave the island after 1760. And so the British ambassador, Macartney, comes and goes, "Hey."
He didn't actually talk like Fonzie from Happy Days, but
he said, "Hey, can we rearrange things?" And he asked to exchange an ambassador between London and Beijing, and do a couple of other things to put Britain and the Qing on a more equal footing, as opposed to having Britain in a subservient relationship as Qing China was with all other countries that it did business with. We should point out, so countries, this is true of countries of Qing China's relationship with a lot of different countries. So Korea had a similar relationship where essentially they had to go to China and beg to have diplomatic relations. China magnanimously said, sure, you can come here and send your ambassadors. And these ambassadorial missions were essentially large. They were called tribute missions, but they were actually large trade missions. So ambassadors would come from Korea, I think 3 or 4 times a year. I'm not actually sure on the number, but they would come and they would offer tribute gifts to the emperor, and they would receive gifts, and then along the way they could trade, but that kind of trade was not open to Europeans.
England wants in. They send an ambassador. It goes awesome, and the Qing court and the British Empire are on an equal footing as fellow brothers in the international trade, right, Lee?
Not exactly. Macartney was kind of brushed aside. He presented a letter from King George III in a jewel-encrusted box to Qianlong Emperor. He refused to kowtow, actually, to the Qianlong Emperor, and there's a lot of kind of dickering between the Qing side and the British side over whether or not he needed to kowtow. All of the other ambassadors who were presented before the Qianlong Emperor on his birthday in 1793 kowtowed, but Macartney wouldn't, because he said, I wouldn't do this for King George III, so I'm not going to do it for someone else's king. That kind of stuck in the craw.
That's the way things were done at the Qing court.
Yeah. So, anyways, things didn't work out so well. From the emperor's side, nothing really changed, but he wanted to make sure that, for the record, he was really happy that the British were sending their officials there because they were uncultured barbarians, essentially, in the Chinese perspective. These Brits were not really worth the time of day, but he kind of deigns to have an audience before them, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And so he writes this poem after
they leave,
memorializing the visit. Should we just go ahead and read the poem?
Just read the poem. It's not a super long poem.
Rob, do you want to read it?
I'll just read. I'm going to read your translation. It's a good translation.
He looks at me with loving eyes.
Yeah. I usually don't agree to read things that Lee writes because it's usually not worth the effort. But I will deign, as did Qianlong, to do that this time, to accept your tribute. Long title, as so many of these things have. A poem on my feelings after the ambassador of the red-haired English king, Macartney, came to give tribute and offerings to me. The Portuguese long ago sent an ambassador to pay tribute to me. Now the English have imitated the Portuguese in their expressions of loyalty to me. They are from far-away places where mythological figures from ancient China have not tread. Our ancestors' virtue and morality has drawn them from the distant oceans. Even though I see their tribute as ordinary, however, in my heart I find their actions praiseworthy. I do not value their strange speech nor the dazzling cleverness of their things. They came with these few things, and I have sent them away with much. Deep inside me, I do this because I want to preserve peace in order to maintain our success. End quote.
It's sort of dripping with
condensation. I don't think it's really dripping with it may have been if it traveled across the ocean. Condescension, I think. Maybe it's. Although you and I, when we read this poem, partially because I think you've spent more time with this history, I don't see it dripping with condescension. I see it very much as a poem from a great power to a much lesser power, for sure.
Agreed. I think probably dripping is the wrong word, and condensation is certainly the
definitely the wrong word. Although much funnier.
But there is kind of an element of what he's arguing in this poem is that it's mostly about this kind of concern over the Qing and its ancestors, because Qianlong is essentially saying he is such a bad mamma jamma. And his ancestors are such bad mamma jammas.
And mamma jamma, I should point out, is the correct classical term.
Yes, thank you.
Exactly.
I think if I remember correctly, it's a Manchu term.
It's a Manchu term, 4-character term. Mamma jamma, yeah.
But he and his ancestors are such bad mamma jammas that they have attracted these little people from far, far away who are weird and have red hair and do all these kinds of crazy things. And even though he's not at all entertained by their junk, he is going to deign to receive them and send them off with lots of cool stuff.
toys, really, because your translation calls these things full of dazzling cleverness. So it's interesting because it's easy to see the "we're up here, you're down there" tone of it, and yet the last line is interesting to me. Deep inside me, I do this because I want to preserve peace in order to maintain our success. Now, if this was just a little junker nation full of shepherds that have nothing to offer,
which you could argue Britain was at the time.
But then why would it be necessary to placate them to preserve peace? Who cares if you preserve peace with an out-of-the-way nothing nation, right?
But that's part of the claim of each of the dynasties, is that they are able to not only control the region that is quote-unquote China, which I'm not even going to get into how problematic my usage of that term is,
right?
But they are also able to kind of exert a moral suasion over these other little people in far, far away places.
And yet, the last line doesn't talk about moral suasion. It talks about in order to maintain our success. The implication, at least in your translation, is that their continuing success as the Chinese Empire depends in some measure on peace with Britain. So to me, that reads like we recognize this other country is a little bit more than just some junker vassal state. This is something else. We need to deal with this more seriously.
I'm not entirely convinced by your reading, but I
think
appreciate...
this is where I get to blame your translation. If you're not convinced, it's your fault, dude.
I appreciate your questioning of
my condensation.
And Rob, why do you have to leak all over my parade?
I don't know, because it's so much more fun.
But so I think that this poem could possibly be read in a more positive light, and you can think of it with less or more condescension. But it's difficult to get away from the fact that there is more than an element of condescension.
Right.
In this poem,
I agree. Like, I'm never going to get away from. I'm never going to disagree with the idea that this is a poem from a superior to an inferior power, from the Chinese perspective. What I find interesting is those little subtle notes of possibly doubt, or does Qianlong on some level recognize that there's a change in the wind happening? Like, he mentions in the first line the Portuguese coming. So the Portuguese have been in China by this point. How long? Do you know offhand?
I think
a couple of centuries, right?
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, the Portuguese actually got property in China, essentially colonial property handed to them, not by the Qing government, but by the Ming government.
Yeah.
And the Ming-Qing switch-off happened in 1644. So probably around 1600.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
And so for most of that time, the only European country to do anything really is Portugal. Or Italy, I suppose. Italy, you have Italian and French Jesuits coming.
You have a lot of French and Italian Jesuits. There's a lot of European involvement in China, much more than in kind of the traditional historiography is given.
So, and I'm curious about this because I can't remember. Is that none of those though are official governmental relationships, right? It's a trade, like the trade route is open, so traders can come from these countries, but there's no official. Like the French court doesn't have an ambassador in the Qing court, right?
So what's interesting is a lot of Western officials ended up serving in the Qing government. Those Jesuits you were talking about, one of the Jesuits was sent by the Kangxi Emperor, which, if I remember correctly, is the grandfather of Qianlong. The kind of lineage escapes me right now. But the Kangxi Emperor sent a Jesuit under his command to have a meeting with the Pope. Now, this is a Catholic missionary in China representing the Chinese court in Rome to the papacy. So
a lot of stuff going on there,
right? Yeah. So there was a lot of kind of involvement that your normal history of China kind of skips over,
right? But I mean, like, for example, like famously when Trump became president and the president of Taiwan called him and said congrats, there was great uproar in China over it because it made it sound like he was acknowledging that Taiwan did in fact have an independent political status from China, et cetera, et cetera. So there's kind of an official, we recognize that you are a power and we are going to work with you as another government sort of thing. I don't know how much of that exists between European powers and China.
So the tribute relationship under which powers were supposed to kind of submit gifts, and the Qing magnanimously accepted them, was kind of the farthest that it got in those sorts of relationships. So the Portuguese have been doing that for a while, and there's actually like there are paintings of the Portuguese kind of giving gifts to the Qing. And just to point something out, not everybody accepted this. So a lot of people were kind of angered by the disregard that the Chinese had for other groups, including the Japanese. The Tokugawa shogunate did not send official representatives to the Qing court because they wouldn't take that crap. They did have an essentially like a second track diplomatic relationship where I forget exactly how it worked, but it was like group from one city, like city officials in one place met with city officials from another place, and they were actually doing national level government. But the Tokugawans were kind of like, well, we're not going to take this crap either.
Well, and I guess one of the reasons I keep kind of prodding at this question is to try to understand, based on the poem more or less alone, where if the Qianlong emperor does in fact sense that things are changing.
I don't think so.
Because, well, here's why I mention it. First line, he mentions the Portuguese. Last line, he mentions the need to preserve peace so that China can continue to prosper. The first line is clearly kind of a rap on the knuckles to the English, like, hey, you've got another European power that'll do this. Why not you? Like, you think you're better than them? That's part of that. But to acknowledge that in order for us to continue to prosper, there has to be peace, to me sounds like, as I mentioned before, that there's something else going on here than just, hey, you're not a tribute. That's not cool, right? And if so, what that actually is. And I wanted to follow that up with, do you think the English should have kowtowed? Because let me make my question a little more robust here. So kowtowing means having much greater access to Chinese markets. If you don't kowtow, you get nothing, right? Or you get like, hey, you can trade your stuff on this coral reef in the middle of the ocean if you want, but nowhere closer. So from the perspective of making money and getting what you wanted, which is more robust trade relations, doesn't it make sense to kowtow?
So we should point out first off what a kowtow is, just for the listener who may not be familiar. Kowtow is Chinese for, in Mandarin, it's pronounced ketou. It's become a word in English that means to kind of be subservient, but literally it meant to smack the head against the ground. Normally, I think 3 times, and it's the sign of subservience that the British read as being kind of servile to the point of unacceptability.
Right.
In terms of advising Macartney on whether or not he should have done the kowtow.
Just do it. Just go for it.
I my time machine is still broken.
Dang it.
So I'm not going to go back into 1793 and advise British folks on their tea policy or whatever. I would just point back to the fact that the Tokugawan government said, hey, we're not going to kind of take this kind of treatment. And they arranged a sort of workaround that allowed them to not have official relations, but kind of survive in terms of their next door neighbor and this giant power that Qing China was. I mean, we're talking about the 4th largest empire in history.
Yeah.
Like the 4th largest land empire in history. It's huge. It's larger than today's PRC. This is a very impressive country, but they were asking things that not only the British but also the Japanese felt was demeaning.
Right. I guess my question then would be why the Portuguese did it, because surely policy hadn't changed too much between the Ming and now.
No.
So
No.
I guess, and I'm not asking that we fix past policy. The reason I ask is it's always interesting when you reach a hinge point in history. You know, what would have happened if Macartney had simply said, you know what, whatever, I don't care what this means. We're going to get trade relations. Let's just get out of here and go home. We're not coming back anyway, so who cares?
So the thing is, the Portuguese didn't actually have that kind of... So the British were asking for a trade of ambassadors between London and Beijing, and to have more representation throughout China. The Portuguese were limited in where they could go. They didn't have an ambassador come from Beijing to Lisbon. They didn't get the privileges that the British wanted. They had I don't even know if they had a better deal because they were kowtowing. I don't even know if they had a better deal than the British did without the kowtow. I mean, these things. So we should point out these kind of history lessons can get caught up in
exactly the kind of questions I'm asking.
Contemporary geopolitics, and I think it's incumbent upon you and me as scholars to go, let's keep it, let's keep the questions in 1793 and see it how and how the participants saw it, and that's kind of why I was like, well, from the Qianlong's perspective, the British were just this kind of cold island who had wool and really like some trinkets and nothing else, right? Like they had a right. Qianlong had a right to look down on the British of 1793. Like he had this amazing empire.
Yeah.
Let's not forget his perspective and that he had a rational reason to kind of be condescending.
Yeah. It's not necessarily condescension if you can back it up, maybe.
Right? Like, I mean, it is condescension if the president of the United States is writing to, a child
President
somewhere.
Xi Jinping, yeah.
A child.
It's not condescension, right?
No. It is condescension.
Oh,
like the president is literally condescending to, like, write a letter to a child, but that's not a criticism of a president who does that, right? Like, that there is a clear separation in terms of like power and ability there. Britain's claim is arrogant in that it's saying that it should be treated like an equal. Who are the British to suggest that they should be equals, right?
Right. Well, whether or not Qianlong senses a change in the wind, I still think the poem lends itself to that a little bit. There's definitely a change in the wind coming, and he's not going to figure it out. His ancestors are going to figure out pretty quickly that things
not
are
his
not
ancestors, but his grandchildren.
Right. Well, isn't that technically an ancestor? Anyway.
No, it's not.
Okay, whatever. His progeny will figure this out very quickly. So it's an interesting piece in history because this is one of the last times a Chinese emperor gets to, with, as you mentioned, some justification, look down their nose at a European power. That's gonna end pretty soon.
I think that's a great place to end it. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.